Yes, book. Hello, everyone. Today it's an absolute honor to have Mr. Vijay Prashad. He is a historian, political commentator, and the director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. So, Mr. Vijay Prashad, thank you so much for your time and welcome.
It's a pleasure, Prajwal. It's a pleasure. Yeah.
So I would like to start by talking about Israel Palestine. Now
Yeah.
that a very fragile ceasefire is in place in Gaza, I would like to ask you how can the people of Gaza attain permanent peace? Because now that the Israel dropping of bombs has stopped, we have seen some videos of Hamas allegedly carrying out executions. So how can the people of Gaza attain permanent peace? And what would be the political solution for attaining this?
Well, I mean, the first thing is that people need to understand that this goes back several decades. This is not a new problem. It has to be seen that Gaza was, of course, the place where the first refugees came in 1948 during the Nakba. And then it became effectively a refugee area. There are three big cities in Gaza City, Khan Yunis, and Rafah. There used to be an airport near Rafah that was destroyed by the Israelis 25 years ago. Um, when the Israelis occupied Gaza in 1967, they basically took it over. And they occupied at the same time the West Bank, which had been under Jordanian jurisdiction, and they occupied East Jerusalem, also under Jordanian jurisdiction. So these three places, not contiguous, are the occupied Palestinian territory. This is a legal term. An area occupied under international law needs to have some rights itself, and the person who's doing the occupying must follow international law. Now, it turns out that Israel has violated international law in its role as the occupier. So there are International Court of Justice rulings going back now decades about the building of illegal settlements in the West Bank, about building roads that are solely for Israelis in the West Bank, about annexation of very large parts of East Jerusalem, the building of an apartheid wall, building of settlements in Gaza. Before 2005, there were Israeli illegal settlements in Gaza. There are also court cases and rulings about Israel's practice of administrative detention, which is unlawful. The grabbing of young people off the street, throwing them in prison, saying without habeas corpus that they are under administrative detention, they haven't been arrested. This has been found to be unlawful, illegal, continues. There are thousands of Palestinians in administrative detention. When you have a condition like this of colonization, of occupation, it really distorts all social and political life. The people living in Gaza, the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, in fact, indeed, Palestinians everywhere have a distorted life because they are under colonial rule. So it's very crazy to judge anything based on, let's say, what happens, in another country, in the Netherlands or in Japan. Why isn't Gaza like Japan? Well, Japan isn't currently occupied, although I would perhaps contest that, saying there's so many US bases in Japan that perhaps the term occupation applies. I mean, Japan had a prime minister in 2009, Hatoyama, who was removed by the United States. So anyway, maybe that was a bad example. So when one comes to Gaza, in 2005, there were legislative elections. Hamas won the elections. The Israelis colluded with a section of the political group in Gaza, many of them with the Fatah, party. They colluded with them, they armed them to basically attack Hamas and prevent Hamas from taking power in Gaza, even though they won the legislative election fair and square. Now, you and I may have differences with the Muslim Brotherhood, with Hamas and so on, but in fact, they did win the election. So why not allow them to govern at the municipal and the regional level? Well, the United States, European Union, and Israel have basically made every single Palestinian group a terrorist organization. I mean, they have named them all as terrorists, even though the United Nations has not. This is a very important point. Hamas is not on the UN sanctions list. It's only an unlawful designation by the United States, European Union, and Israel. I mean, unlawful because you don't have UN Security Council resolution saying that this is a terrorist organization. Why should India, for instance, repeat that it's a terrorist organization? India hasn't designated Hamas as a terrorist organization. On what basis? It's not on the UN sanctions list. What terrorist attack has Hamas done to India? Why? Why should other countries follow the United States? That's unlawful. It's against international law. So Hamas has within Gaza been largely the most important political force alongside the Islamic Jihad. Now, they are claiming that the people they are going after are people who colluded with Israel during the genocide. That's what they are claiming. These probably are internal fights, but this is a natural condition of the distortions of an occupation. This is not something that's there in the character of the Palestinian people. I think that's not the correct way to understand it. This is a distortion of the occupation system. The occupation system has to end. You asked a question, how can people in Gaza live in peace? Well, end the occupation. End the occupation. You can't have the Indian government saying that, well, we follow the two-state solution. That's what the Indian government's formal policy. If you follow the two-state solution, then why are you okay with the occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza? That's supposed to be the Palestinian state.
So it's interesting that you mentioned the history because it is very important for people to understand the overall context. Given that Hamas has allegedly accepted the US demand to disarm, do you think that is possible? Because there's a lot of complexities to be solved, and Hamas has also stated that unless there is a definitive political solution, that they will refuse to disarm. So how do you see this going forward? Because they've also stated that they won't accept any foreign role in governing Gaza, like Trump has envisioned himself and Tony Blair. So how do you see this complexities getting resolved going forward? Because there are very, very complex issues, and I think, like you said, it will require a lot of compromise on all sides.
Well, look, let's look at this regionally. The United States and the European Union are putting pressure on the government of Lebanon, which, by the way, doesn't have an air force, doesn't have the capacity to police its own airspace. In other words, Lebanese airspace is flooded with Israeli drones, with Israeli planes. Lebanon doesn't have air defense systems. It doesn't even really have an effective military, if I'm honest with you. I've lived in Lebanon. I was recently in Beirut and in parts of the south of Lebanon. There's no evidence of a Lebanese military anywhere. There's a lot of pressure on the Lebanese government to get Hezbollah to disarm. So this disarmament thing is not just about Hamas. It's happening around the region. The way in which Israel provided air support for Al-Qaeda's Ahmad Shara to take power in Syria is part of the disarmament of any resistance forces, because when Ahmad Shara came into Damascus, one of the first things he did was he told the Palestinian factions to get out of town. Effectively, they disarmed the Palestinians in Syria. So this is a regional issue. This is not just about Hamas. In Lebanon, it is ludicrous to ask Hezbollah to disarm, because Hezbollah has provided the only military force to defend the sovereignty of Lebanon. I mean, it's like asking the Indian military to disarm. If India didn't have a military and there was some paramilitary force, would you be comfortable saying, let them disarm in the face of an aggressor? An aggressor that continues to violate the airspace of your country. It's ludicrous demand. So that same demand is now placed on Hamas. And in fact, Hamas was in a position to accept anything, to sign anything. I mean, what everybody knows, there are two phases to the peace deal. Everybody knows that it's phase one that is going to be, validated. That is to say, the transfer of the hostages, the transfer of the remains of the prisoners and so on, the Palestinian prisoners being released, and then the entry of aid, the cessation of violence and so on. The second phase is not going to be go through. And that's where the question of disarmament comes. It's not going to happen. Why? Because Israel is simply not going to end the occupation. I mean, that's the fundamental issue here. It's not Hamas disarming. The occupation starts in 1967. Okay, the Nakba took place in 1948. Hamas was founded in 1987, 20 years after the occupation begins. So you can't say that Hamas disarmament is the primary issue. If you just look at this historically, the occupation starts 20 years before Hamas is founded, for God's sake. So in fact, the onus is on Israel to end the occupation. So to say that the issue of disarmament is primary would be incorrect. And we know that this is not just about Hamas. It's about Israel attempting to erase all so-called security threats against Israel. In fact, they are not security threats against Israel. They are security defenses against Israeli aggression. I mean, Lebanon has never attacked Israel, but Israel has not only attacked Lebanon, but has come in and invaded and occupied Lebanon.
So, since the occupation, I think, would never be ended by Israel, do you fear that the war may resume again?
Yeah, well, firstly, I'm not one of those who believes that the occupation cannot end, because that's a futility. That's the thought of the futile. I do believe, number one, that until the occupation ends, this war will return. And it has returned. I mean, Israel has never stopped attacking the Palestinians. Okay, the PLO was founded in 1964. But the attacks on the Palestinians, the attack on Palestinian homes and lands go back long. Deir Yassin massacre, conducted by the Israelis in the village of Deir Yassin, took place before the PLO was founded, before the Fedayeen start their operations. The PLO is a consequence of the Israeli Nakba. It wasn't the author of the Nakba. It wasn't the author of the conflict. Okay? The way in which Israel, I mean, imagine this. Imagine that the British say we are going to partition India and Pakistan. And then, although India was the larger country, just for the sake of an Indian viewer, I'm saying, imagine if Pakistani armies rolled across the line of control and entered Punjab and in fact took all of India. Yeah, and just left behind a little bit, maybe parts of Tamil Nadu, Kerala, too far away for the tanks to go, but took all of India and occupied it and made the Indians second-class citizens. Yeah, then what would you say? Would you say, well, we should now live in peace? Would you be happy with that? There was a partition plan in 1948. Yeah, Israel violated the partition plan, rolled over all the land, took everything. Yeah, would India be happy if that had happened? I mean, India right now sits and says, "Oh, we are with the Israelis." Most of the Indian population seems to be pro-Israel. The Indian government seems to be pro-Israel. Really? I think it's hypocritical. Imagine if if the Pakistanis had violated. Pakistan didn't violate the agreement. There was some issue in Kashmir, but that's a minor part of land compared to all of it. Neither India nor Pakistan violated the partition plan, although the partition plan was imposed on us, just as the partition plan, British imposed it on the Israelis, or at the time, the Jewish population and the Palestinians imposed it. But the state of Israel was founded and they took all the land. Now you tell me if that's acceptable.
No. So, how do you think the occupation can be ended? Because the Western countries, except the US, most of them have recognized the state of Palestine. So, do you think, and Israel is also being increasingly isolated in the world? I mean, in the US itself, it has lost support among younger Republicans. So, how can the occupation realistically be ended going forward into the future?
Yeah, I mean, look, firstly, there has to be some pressure coming from the countries of the global south. Okay, I mean, India needs to really think hard about this love affair. I mean, the BJP needs to think hard, and Mr. Modi, in the middle of this genocide, sending birthday greetings to Benjamin Netanyahu, and then the Indian government welcoming a trade delegation, and signing a trade deal in the middle of this genocide. It's a scandal. The birthday greeting was to me actually very vulgar. My friend Mr. Netanyahu, happy birthday. What a vulgar thing to do. It's a genocide recognized by the International Court of Justice. Yeah, it's a slap in the face of the Palestinian people at the time. Yeah, again, it's really not thought through. Why is India, so excited about this? Is it a kind of anti-Muslim thing? Is that it? That would be very vulgar. That would be very, very. That would be beneath our dignity. Okay, we still have a constitution in India. Yeah, we still have the premise of a non-aligned foreign policy. Yeah, that would be very vulgar. Countries around the global south need to break ties with Israel. This is ridiculous. Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. And then that would put more pressure on Europe and the United States. It's got to come from outside. And the reason it has to come from outside, Prajwal, is that the Israelis are systematically not allowing the Palestinians to develop a politics. Yeah, Palestinian political leaders, Marwan Barghouti, leader of Fatah, 23 years and 6 months in an Israeli prison. Ahmad al-Sadat, leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, in an Israeli prison for 23 years and 8 months. Hamas leadership consistently killed off. United States, European Union, Israel constantly designating Palestinian political organization as terrorists. They're not allowing Palestine to have a political voice. And so, the Palestinians don't have the ability to do a politics. When the people of Gaza tried to do a non-violent march, they were massacred. They marched to the pyramid, the Great March of Return. There were snipers sitting there and hitting people in the eye. That created a lot of anger. What happened on 7th of October was built from the anger at what the Israelis did at the Great March of Return, just a year and a half before then. So the Palestinians are not allowed to develop a politics. It's got to come from outside.
And my final question about this segment would be, how can the other great powers, including Russia and China, Russia already has made it stand clear that they are in favor of a creation of a Palestinian state. I want to like to ask your opinion about the role of how China can help with Palestine, because there's actually not been much great reporting, I would say, on how Chinese relations with Palestine. So, uh, if am I correct in saying that China has been a bit reticent in kind of being more vocal about this issue?
Well, the first thing is China, like India, like many of the BRICS countries, has made it very clear that they stand on principle on the two-state solution. And they would like the state of Palestine to be established without the Israeli occupation. They have, in that sense, gone a little ahead of the Indian government, because the Indian government says we are for a two-state solution. But they don't say that the implication of that is that the occupation has to end. You can't be for a two-state solution and then not have the occupation end. The Chinese have actually said that. They've gone ahead of the Indians on that point. Now, China also hosted, for the first time in over 25 years, a meeting of the 14 Palestinian factions. So as high leadership as possible came from all the Palestinian political parties to Beijing in 2024, and they signed a 14-party declaration. This was a pretty extraordinary moment because, in fact, this is something that had not happened, in as I said, a quarter century. So it was a very important gesture by the Chinese government to do this. The Chinese have also done a pretty good job at the United Nations, pushing for the ceasefire and so on. What we haven't seen is a complete rupture of relations. The Chinese haven't said, for instance, like the Colombians have said, that we are going to break ties with Israel. China has not been one of those countries that breaks ties with countries easily. It's pretty, shall we say, small c conservative in following international rules and procedures. But they have been, as long as, as far as possible, they have been pretty strong in supporting the emergence of a Palestinian politics. I think that needs to be pointed out. But yes, of course, I quite agree. Much more can be done. And I very much hope much more can be done.
What about the role of Russia?
Yeah, this is a much more complicated situation because, in a way, Russia is freer to do things than China. Russia has already had many countries break relations with it, and therefore is a little freer. It doesn't have to have the Europeans on the one side and the this on the other. I mean, the Europeans have basically ruptured ties with Russia, so Russia actually can do more and does a little more. They have been stronger in their language, condemning the genocide and so on. But, what can they do? The question to ask is, why can't they fly planes to do a no-fly zone? But where would they fly the planes from? See, the real question, Prajwal, isn't Russia and China. It's why hasn't Egypt, with its immense military and air force, conducted a no-fly zone over Gaza to protect the Palestinians from Israeli bombardment? If there were Egyptian planes flying over Gaza, it would make it very difficult for the Israelis to fire missiles and artillery shells into Gaza, and particularly if the Egyptian aircraft got permission from the UN Security Council, it's unlikely to attack, artillery barrages that were firing into Gaza. Because in fact, that was UN Resolution 1973 in the question of Libya. Libya, there was a minor death toll compared to Gaza. It's interesting that the West was so exasperated about a genocide in Libya, which was not happening, and was completely cavalier about a real genocide in Gaza. It tells you what they think about the Palestinians.
Sure, so it remains to be seen, and I like the way you explained the history of Gaza, and one remains hopeful that the occupation can be ended and the Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace.